Let's talk about how Vite made Remix better. So Mark and I both learned a lot as we migrated Remix onto Vite, and there's just too much to talk about there. So instead, today, we're each going to pick one thing to highlight. So I'd like to start by talking about server code removal in Remix. So this is what a route in Remix looks like. Let's say we've got a loader here that is supplying some data, and that's running on the server. And we've got a component here that's in charge of using that data to display something nice to our users in their browser. And this one file is actually contributing to both the client and the server bundle. And that's nice ergonomics, but it means we have to be really careful to make sure that server code doesn't end up in the client. We don't want weird things happening like the browser to try to access files and that crashing. And even worse, we don't want any secrets or sensitive information from our server to get leaked on the client for anyone to see in their browser. So this loader has to go when we're building the client bundle. And not only that, we have to make sure that we don't leave any dangling things like this DB import here around for the client bundle either. We don't want that module to be polluting the browser. So we just want to end up with the stuff that is really designed for the client, like this. And the way we were accomplishing that is we were using tree shaking. So with ES-Build, prior to our adoption of Vite, we were just adding a virtual module in front of our routes. In this case, we've got this one client post that is just giving a view, a client-based view of this post route, and it's just re-exporting things from that route. And specifically, it's only re-exporting the things that are safe for the client. In this case, the default export. And so when a bundler like ES-Build looks at this, it realizes that the only interesting export in this module is the default one. All the other exports aren't being asked for, so we can get rid of those. And anything that those exports depended on that isn't being depended on by the default can go too. So it just tree shakes away all the rest of this code, and it does the server code removal for us, which is fantastic. Bundlers like ES-Build are really good at optimizations like this, right? And that's something that we got when we moved to Vite, because Vite is using rollup under the hood. So even though it's a different bundler, we're still getting that tree shaking happening for us. And so when we wrote tests initially, it looked like everything was passing because we were just doing a Vite build and then seeing if that looked correct. But as soon as we were starting to be good citizens and actually test the dev server as well, we ran into some issues. And that's because Vite doesn't do any bundling in development. Bundling is expensive and slow, and so it makes sense to do for production build, but it's sort of antithetical to a fast, good developer experience. So Vite doesn't do it in development. So we were a little stuck. We needed to find a way to remove these server exports. And what we realized was that removing server-only code from route modules is part of Remix's semantics. It's what makes Remix behave correctly. It's not something that we could just delegate to an optimization layer like tree shaking, especially if there's no bundle around. And so we decided to do this as part of Remix supplied transforms so that we could ensure that they always ran as part of your build or in your dev server. So now, if we look at that same post route, we can see that the inspect plugin is telling us that a couple transforms are happening to it. And notably, there's this Remix route exports transform that's happening that we're supplying. And we're removing that loader export. And we're also running some dead code elimination to remove that dangling database import as well. Great. So now we're getting rid of those server-only exports and the things that they depend on inside of route modules. And if you're authoring a new framework today from scratch, I would advise you to just have separate files for these things and don't mix server-only code with client-safe code in a single file. But we couldn't do that option because we're trying to land our Vite integration as an incremental upgrade for people inside of V2, Remix V2. And asking all of our users to refactor every single one of their routes to be two separate files and decide names for those files and come up with new file-based routing conventions that would allow all this, that was too heavy-handed. And so we couldn't use that option. We had to find a way to make this work for our users with the files that they had today. And that's why we chose to do this via AST transforms rather than asking users to split things up manually into separate files. Plus, even if you did do that, you'd still have to solve for a human error case. So let's look at this simple route where now, instead of using a loader, I'm just going to access the database module directly and ask for all my posts directly inside my component. And so we know that this line right here is doing some server-only code, and it's going to end up in the client bundle. And before Vite, this is something you could have done in a Remix application, and you wouldn't really know that this was an issue. Things might build just fine. If you never visited this page, maybe your smoke test didn't exercise this page either, and you never knew that something was wrong, and so you shipped this to production. But we know that as soon as you visit this route, something here is going to go wrong. Either things will crash, or if somehow this database query runs, you might leak some weird information to the client. So we need to get rid of this import as well, and that line too. So how do we deal with this case and just make sure that people never do something like this? And what we came up with was .server files. So by adding a suffix, .server in this case, to these modules, we could tell Remix that this was a special way to know that this was a server-only module that was being imported. And by knowing this, Remix could actually give you much nicer build time errors. So rather than this ever landing in production, we could tell you in your CI or in your dev server that something was wrong. And this is what that looks like. If you ever accidentally import a .server file and it's still there after we've done removal of server-only code in your route modules, you're going to see an error like this one. And so it's going to tell you, hey, there's server-only code ending up in the client. It's coming from db.server. It's part of this route. Here's what you can do about it. Here's more information. So we think this is actually a really nice solution. And getting those build time errors is so much better than seeing this just blow up at runtime. So we learned a lot, and we actually wrote 2 decision documents about all the things we learned. One centered on tree shaking, and the other on client-server separation. But at the end of the day, the way to summarize those 2 things is that we really need explicit server separation. We know what exports are server-only in Remix, so we can handle those for you, and we've added .server files so that you can tell us what things in userland are server-only as well. And all of this is now statically enforced, and you get build time errors instead of runtime errors that you might have never caught. So this is, I think, a really fantastic way that Vite helped us rethink some of our design decisions and make them better. And now let's hear from Mark and see what example he picked.
Hey everyone, my name is Mike Dalgleish, and for part 2 of how Vite made Remix better, I'm going to be covering the topic of CSS bundling. Now, in Remix's original ESBuild-based compiler, Remix introduced a novel approach to CSS, which is that when you import a CSS file, what you get is a URL to the CSS file that you want to render into the page. This pairs well with Remix's ability to attach link tags to any nested route. So here you can see we're taking the href that we imported earlier and we're attaching it to a link tag. So rounding out a full page, it might look something like this, where what we're doing is importing the styles as an href, we're attaching it to a link tag, and then the component for this route is able to freely access the styles that have been injected into the page. This model is super simple and leans into web standards, which of course is something that Remix has become well known for. It's just regular old CSS files attached to nested routes. But this approach didn't come without its trade-offs, namely that it introduces quite a bit of boilerplate for reusable components in particular. So for example, if you have a shared button component, whereas typically you might think that all you need to do is import and render the component, you now also need to think about its link tag so that it has any necessary styles injected into the page alongside it. The challenge with this, of course, as well, is that these component styles are now tied to Remix. So if you are building a shared component library across multiple projects, you now need to think about whether you need to support Remix or non-Remix consumers in parallel. To address this limitation, the Remix compiler introduced new features for CSS bundling, such as CSS side effect imports and CSS modules. And in order to get access to those styles in the page, it still needed to fit into the Remix model of having a link tag in the page. So to do this, what you needed to do was import the CSS bundle package, which provided the CSS bundle href. So the downside of this is it meant that all bundled CSS was in a single file, but this was enough to unblock many people who were unable to port over to Remix. Now, when we moved over to Vite, Vite made us revisit our approach to CSS. And that's because, to its credit, Vite ships a lot of really great CSS features out of the box. So you don't have to install any plugins to get all of the standard CSS features you might expect up and running. So for example, here you can see using import inline and rebasing, post CSS support, CSS modules, Lightning CSS, and so on. So to be truly Vite native when moving to Vite, Remix needed to support Vite's built-in CSS features. The most exciting of which for us was support for CSS chunking provided by Rollup. So that meant that no longer would Remix have a single CSS file containing all CSS for the entire application. Instead, it would be much more like what you expect from JavaScript chunking when using Remix. Now, the way that works under the hood in Remix via the classic compiler is that each nested route has fields in the manifest that describe which JavaScript files needed to be loaded in order to render this route. So how do we support CSS chunking? Well, we basically need to take a similar approach, which is that when you import a CSS file using a mechanism that implies the use of a bundler, such as a CSS side effect import, what we need to do is similarly attach the assets to the manifest. So in this case, there's now a new CSS field on the Remix manifest that describes the CSS files that are needed in order to render this route. So Vite forced us to make Remix's CSS better. And what we've ended up with here is more portable, more configurable via the Vite config, and better build output. But this still came with one big trade-off, and that's Vite's approach to lazy loading in development. Now, this is obviously one of its big selling points, but it introduces a challenge for CSS. And that's because when you import CSS in this way within a JavaScript file, there's really no native counterpart that it can directly translate to in the same way it can with JavaScript modules. So in practice, what this means is that CSS file that you're importing has to be translated into this JavaScript file that in effect injects a string of CSS into the page as a side effect of being imported. This means that the CSS is loaded and injected after the HTML has already been rendered by your server, effectively introducing a flash of unstyled content. Now, in practice, I'm sure you've seen that this is not something that happens during development. And the way we fix this is by, during development, again, not during production, what we do is we look at the module graph to figure out which CSS files are related to the routes that are being rendered. We grab all the CSS for those routes and inject them into an inline style tag in the page. So this fixes the problem, but introduces a new problem at the same time, which is that CSS differs between development and production. Now, in a lot of cases, and arguably most cases, this doesn't introduce problems, but it can introduce subtle bugs where the CSS in your development environment differs slightly from production. And that's because CSS is much more sensitive to reordering than what you experience with JavaScript. You can't simply take a collection of CSS, slice it up into pieces and reorder it, and then expect it to have the same specificity. So this can lead to scenarios where styles subtly change in your development and production environments. Really not ideal. So how do we take on the classic Remix approach in Vite where we import real CSS files in development? Is this possible? Luckily, Vite also gives us this mechanism of attaching a URL query string to CSS imports. And what this does is give us the same mechanism that we saw in the classic Remix compiler, where you're given a URL to a real CSS file. So given Remix supports this as a first-class feature at the route level for rendering link tags, we can take this output from Vite and simply attach it to the given route. So here what we're getting is, even in development, real CSS link tags rendered into the page, even during SSR. So in development, what you're going to see is a link to a real CSS file as it exists on disk in your source directory, but in production, you're going to get those fingerprinted assets with content hashes in the file names as you would expect. So here what we found is that Vite has made Remix's CSS better, but thanks to URL, the query string parameter that you can pass to your CSS imports, I think we've helped go the other way as well. And Remix has actually helped to make Vite's CSS better too. So on the topic of how Vite made Remix better, that's it for us today. Thank you so much for listening.